The Holt Ground, Part 1, $2 in a deed. The alarm went off at 4:45, same as always. Delia Holt did not groan. She did not lie there bargaining with the ceiling. She simply opened her eyes, swung her feet to the cold linoleum floor, and stood up. That was the whole of her morning ritual. There was no time for anything more complicated than standing up. The apartment was small in the way that only apartments built for people with no options can be small. The kitchen and the living room were the same room. The bathroom door did not close all the way because the floor had warped sometime in the last decade and no one had ever fixed it. The single bedroom belonged to Eli because Eli was 3 years old and deserved a door that closed, and Delia slept on a pull-out sofa that left a ridge down the center of her back every single morning. She had stopped noticing the ridge about a year ago. That was the thing about discomfort. If it lasted long enough, it just became the shape of your life. She made coffee in the dark, moving by memory through the kitchen. 4 scoops, just enough water. She had learned to be precise about coffee because precise coffee meant she did not have to buy it at the gas station on the way to work. And that saved $1.30 a day, which was $6.50 a week, which was $26 a month, which was when you were Delia Holt. The difference between making rent and not making rent. This was how she thought, everything reduced to its smallest unit, everything calculated. It was not pessimism, it was survival arithmetic, and she had been doing it since she was 16 years old when her mother died and left her alone in a system that was designed to process children, not raise them. She stood at the kitchen window while the coffee brewed and looked out at the street below. Philadelphia at 5 in the morning was a different city than Philadelphia at noon. Quieter, more honest. The streets were wet from overnight rain, and the orange glow of the streetlights made the puddles look like scattered pieces of a broken sunset. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck was running its engine, and the low rumble of it was the only sound in the world. Delia drank her coffee standing up. She always did. Sitting down in the morning felt like a luxury she had not earned yet. She checked on Eli before she left. He was curled on his side in his small bed, one fist tucked under his chin, his breathing slow and even. His dark hair was damp against his forehead. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him breathe the way she had done every single morning since they brought him home from the hospital, and she had understood fully and finally that she was completely on her own. She had been terrified that night. She was less terrified now, but only because there had not been enough quiet moments to be terrified in. Fear required space. Delia Holt did not have space. She left him with Mrs. Paulson next door, who watched Eli 5 mornings a week for a fee that Delia paid in cash every Friday, always on time, because the one thing she had learned from growing up with nothing was that the people who helped you had to be treated like gold because there were not very many of them. The diner was called Carver's. It had been called Carver's since 1974, and nothing about it suggested that the year was any later than that. The countertops were the original laminate, repaired in 3 places with strips of silver tape. The booths were vinyl cracked and recracked. The coffee urns were so old that the manufacturer no longer made replacement parts, and Jimmy, who owned the place, had learned to fix them himself with pieces cannibalized from other machines. It smelled like bacon grease and dish soap, and to Delia, after 3 years, it smelled like work, which was the best smell in the world because work meant a paycheck, and a paycheck meant Eli's daycare, and Eli's daycare meant she could come back here tomorrow and do it again. She worked the breakfast rush with a focused efficiency that the other waitresses called scary and that Delia thought of as simply necessary. Table 4 wanted their eggs over easy, not over medium. Table 7's coffee was always decaf, even though they never specified it because they forgot that they had specified it the last 14 times. The man at the counter, who came in every Tuesday and Thursday, always needed a second creamer, even when he said he was fine. She knew these things the way a soldier knows the terrain of a battlefield. Not because she cared about eggs and coffee, but because knowing them meant better tips, and better tips meant the difference between, and then the letter came. It arrived with the first mail of the morning, slipped through the slot by the door, and picked up by Jimmy, who brought it to Delia between the 7 o'clock rush and the 8 o'clock lull. He looked at the envelope with a vaguely suspicious expression, the way he looked at anything that arrived wearing official letterhead. Marsh and Associates Attorneys at Law, Harlan County, Pennsylvania. Delia did not know anyone in Harlan County, Pennsylvania. She barely knew where Harlan County was. She read the letter twice, standing by the coffee station, with the noise of the diner around her. It was brief, formal, precise. Her grandmother, one Margaret Agnes Holt, had passed away. Delia was named as the sole heir to her estate. Her presence was requested at the offices of Gerald Marsh to discuss the disposition of said estate at her earliest convenience. The matter was described as time-sensitive. Her grandmother. Delia set the letter down on the counter beside the coffee urns and stood very still for a moment. She had a grandmother. She had possessed a grandmother all this time, a living person somewhere in the mountains of rural Pennsylvania, and she had not known it, and now that person was dead, and apparently she had left Delia something. Her mother had mentioned her once, late on a night when Delia was perhaps 11 or 12, when her mother had been unable to sleep and had come and sat on the edge of Delia's bed in the dark. She'd said her mother's name just once, Agnes. And then she had said in the flat, careful voice of someone describing a wound they had learned to live with, "She chose that place over me. That land and those trees were more important than her own daughter." That was all. Delia had never asked again because her mother's voice that night had not invited questions. And then her mother had gotten sick, and then her mother was gone, and the questions she had never asked calcified into something she simply carried like scar tissue, like the ridge in her back from the pull-out sofa. She asked Jimmy for a morning off the following week. He gave it to her without argument. He had always been decent to her in the straightforward, undemonstrative way of men who respected people who showed up and did the work. He didn't ask what the letter was about. She didn't explain. That was the nature of their arrangement, and it had worked for 3 years, and she was grateful for it in the particular way you are grateful for things that simply function as they are supposed to. The office of Gerald Marsh occupied the second floor of a brick building on the main street of a small town called Kelton, 2 hours west of Philadelphia by county roads. Delia had taken the bus because the used Civic she drove had a transmission that she treated like a patient recovering from surgery, minimal strain, no sudden movements, no hills if she could avoid it. The bus was fine. She had Eli on her lap for most of the ride, and he pressed his nose against the window and watched the city give way to farmland with the undivided attention of someone experiencing something for the very first time. Gerald Marsh was the kind of man who had been born looking like a lawyer. He was somewhere in his 60s, lean and composed with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and a desk so uncluttered it seemed less like a workspace and more like a statement of intent. He shook her hand with a brief, dry grip and gestured toward the chairs across from him without wasting any motion on it. The office smelled of old paper and something like cedar. A clock ticked on the wall. Eli sat in Delia's lap and examined a pen he had found on the edge of the desk with the focused intensity of a scientist. Marsh opened a folder and then looked at it for a moment, then looked at her, then looked back at the folder. He said her grandmother had been in a care facility for the last year of her life. He said the property had been vacant during that time. He said the estate consisted of 2 items. First, he slid a piece of cardstock across the desk. It was thick, cream-colored, printed with ornate lettering. A deed. The property at 14 Ember Ridge Road, Harlan County, Pennsylvania. Approximately 5 acres with a structure. She did not reach for it. And second, he opened a small envelope. He tipped it gently. 2 $1 bills settled onto the polished surface of the desk, soft and a little crumpled, like something that had been carried a long way. Eli looked at them. He pointed one small finger. "Money, Mama." Delia laughed. She did not mean to. It came out of her involuntarily, a short, sharp sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they have been expecting a blow and the blow turns out to be somehow both smaller and larger than anticipated. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Marsh waited. "It's a legal formality in many cases," he said with the careful neutrality of a man who has delivered difficult news before and knows that the kindest thing you can do is not dress it up. "A token sum to establish the validity of the will." A token. Delia looked at the 2 bills. She thought about the week she had just spent with the word estate floating in her mind like a life raft. She thought about what she could have done with a real estate. She thought about Eli's daycare bill and the leaking faucet in the kitchen and the Civic's transmission and the ridge in her back every single morning. She pulled the $2 toward her and folded them into her jacket pocket. They felt weightless. Marsh continued. He said there was more to discuss. He said a company called Pinnacle Land Group had been attempting to purchase the property from Agnes Holt for many years. He said Agnes had refused consistently and absolutely every single time. He slid another document across the desk, a letter on heavy corporate stationery, dense with formal language that resolved at its center to a single number. $75,000. Delia stared at it. The number did not quite connect to anything real in her experience. It existed in the same category as lottery jackpots and retirement accounts, things that happened to other people in a parallel version of the world where the math worked out differently. Marsh explained. The land was undeveloped. It bordered a state forest. Pinnacle was planning a development luxury cabins, he said, with the controlled expression of a man who is summarizing something without endorsing it. The offer was more than generous given the state of the property. The house was uninhabitable, most likely. 2 years of back property taxes were owed. The sale would cover those, and the remainder, minus his fees, would be hers. He folded his hands on the desk. It's the smart move, he said. A clean break, a fresh start. The words landed on Delia like something she recognized. She had said them to herself or something like them every morning for 3 years. Fresh start. As if starts came fresh, as if you could simply shed the accumulated weight of everything that had come before. She looked at the deed instead of the corporate letter. Ember Ridge Road, she said it quietly to herself. It sounded like a real place. It sounded like a place that existed solid and physical and rooted in the ground in a way that her apartment and the diner and the pull-out sofa did not quite manage. What if I don't want to sell, she asked. The question surprised her as much as it appeared to surprise him. Marsh blinked. He told her that if she declined, the back taxes would be due immediately. The county could move to seize the property. He reminded her with patient precision that the house was likely uninhabitable. And then he said something that caught her. I advised your grandmother to take this deal, he said. It would have made her last year's considerably more comfortable. She was, he paused, searching for the word, unwilling. My mother used to say that, Delia thought. She chose that place over everything. She looked at the deed one more time. Then she looked at the corporate letter. Then she looked at her son, who had lost interest in the pen and was now examining his own hand with enormous gravity. I need to think about it, she said. Marsh gave her 30 days. He said Pinnacle was eager to close before the end of their fiscal quarter. He said time was a factor. He shook her hand again at the door. Brief, dry, the handshake of a man who had done what he could. She walked out into the cool October air with Eli on her hip and the deed in one hand and the $2 bills in her pocket, and she stood on the sidewalk of that quiet main street for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, while the wind moved through the yellowed leaves of the maples overhead and scattered them across the pavement like discarded paper. The deed was heavier than it should have been. She had no explanation for that. It was card stock. It weighed almost nothing. But in her hand on that sidewalk, it felt like something that pulled. That night, Eli was asleep by 8, and Delia sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread in front of her. The electric bill, the rent notice, the Civic's last inspection sticker with its expiration date, the deed square in the middle of all of it like a stone placed deliberately among fallen leaves. She got up and went to the drawer where she kept the photograph. It was the only one she had of Agnes Holt. She had found it in the box of her mother's things after her mother died, tucked between a utility receipt and a birthday card with no signature. Agnes was young in the photograph, no older than Delia was now. She was standing in front of what appeared to be a porch in some stage of construction, raw lumber behind her, tools visible at the edge of the frame. Her hair was loose and there was a streak of dirt across one cheekbone, and she was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not a smile. It was something more direct than a smile. It was the look of someone who had decided something. Delia looked at the photograph for a long time. She held it up near the kitchen light and studied the eyes, which were dark and level and entirely unafraid. She had those eyes. She had seen them in the mirror her whole life and never known where they came from. She put the photograph down next to the deed. In the morning, she called the diner and told Jimmy she needed a few days for a family matter. She used the last of her small emergency savings to buy 2 bus tickets, one for herself, one for Eli, because children under a certain height rode free, but Eli was almost that height now almost, and she did not want to test it. She packed light, a bag for each of them. Eli's stuffed dog, without which the world ended, her one good jacket, the photograph from the kitchen drawer, and the deed placed flat at the bottom of her bag like a foundation being laid. The bus left Philadelphia at 6 in the morning, just as the city was beginning its daily renegotiation with the light. Eli sat in the window seat with his stuffed dog and watched the buildings pass with solemn attention. The city thinned gradually the way cities do, losing its density in stages, first the tall buildings, then the row houses, then the gas stations and strip malls, then the long stretches of commercial road that belonged to no particular place. And then the green came. It came slowly at first in patches, a field here, a stand of trees there. Then it came all at once the way a held breath releases, and the landscape opened up into hills of deep October color, amber and rust, and the dark green of pine. And the sky above it all was the specific sharp blue that only exists in the Northeast in the middle of October, a blue that looked polished, that looked like it had been worked on. Eli pressed his entire face against the glass. Delia watched the landscape change and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not comfort exactly. It was not hope exactly. It was something older than either of those things, something that lived below the level of thought. Something that felt distantly and strangely like recognition. They were the only passengers who got off at Millhaven. The stop was a covered bench outside a general store with a hand-painted sign and a display of seasonal gourds in the window. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh and left them in a silence so absolute and so complete that Delia stood still for a moment just to feel the shape of it. She had grown up with the city's noise as the ambient condition of existence. She had never fully registered it as noise. But standing here, she heard it now by its absence, the way you only notice a sound when it stops. The silence of this place was not empty. It was full of things, wind in the pines somewhere, and the distant, rapid conversation of a creek and birds she could not name calling back and forth above the tree line. Eli looked up at her. "It's quiet, Mama." "It is," she said. She called the number from the general store window. The man who answered said his name was Dale. He said he would be there in 10 minutes, and he was. He was a large, wide man with a gray beard cut close to his jaw and the permanently squinted expression of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He loaded her bag into the trunk of his old sedan without being asked and looked at Eli with the brief, serious assessment of a man who approved of small children on principle. As they drove, Dale talked in the economical way of people who do not use words they do not need. He said Agnes Holt had been in the county his entire life, said she was known, said people had all kinds of stories about her, that she was odd, that she was unfriendly, that she had something to hide. Said the people at Pinnacle Land Group had been sending representatives up here for the better part of 30 years. Lawyers, developers, surveyors who Agnes had on at least one occasion escorted off the property by means he declined to specify. "What did people think she was hiding?" Delia asked. Dale looked at her in the rearview mirror. His eyes held something she could not read. "That's the thing," he said. "Nobody ever found out," which meant the stories just kept growing. He turned off the paved road onto a dirt track that narrowed quickly into something barely wider than the car. Branches scraped against the windows. "My feeling was she wasn't hiding anything. My feeling was she was protecting something. Those are different things." He stopped where the track became impassable and told her it was a quarter-mile on foot from there. He looked at Eli. He looked at her. "You sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. He wrote his number on the back of a gas station receipt and handed it to her. He told her to call when she needed a ride back. He told her not to stay after dark the first night because the house had been vacant for a year and she would need to see it in daylight to know what she was dealing with. She thanked him. He turned the car around with some difficulty and drove back down the track, and then it was just her and Eli and the sound of the forest and the road ahead. They walked. The track wound through dense mixed forest oak and maple, mostly their leaves turned, and some already fallen carpeting, the path in a soft wet layer of amber and brown. The air was cool enough to see your breath. It smelled of wet wood and pine resin, and the particular mineral coldness of a place where the sun did not reach until late in the morning. Eli held her hand and walked without complaint. He had her quality of forward movement, she noticed, of simply proceeding. And then the trees ended, and the path opened into a clearing, and she stopped. The house was small, a salt box street, which meant the roofline dropped steeply at the back, giving it the look of something leaning into the wind. It had been painted blue once, a real color, A considered color, the kind of blue you choose because you want the house to be cheerful, because you want it to look like a home. Now the paint was lifting from the wood in long curling strips, and the gray underneath was the gray of old bone. The porch roof sagged on the left side, one support post having given up its argument with gravity. A window on the ground floor was boarded over with a piece of plywood that someone had taken the time to nail down neatly, the way you do something when you expect to come back for it. But it was standing. After a year empty, after years of neglect, after everything, it was standing. And behind it, Delia did not have words for what was behind it. The house sat on the crest of a long, gradual slope, and behind it the land fell away into a valley so wide and so deep and so full of October color that it looked less like a real place than like something painted. A river ran along the valley floor in long, easy curves, silver in the afternoon light. Beyond the river, the land rose again into the long blue ridges of the Appalachian Range, range after range, each one slightly paler than the one before it, fading into the sky at a horizon so distant it might have been the edge of the world. The light was doing something particular with the clouds above the mountains, sending long columns of gold down into the valley below, moving slowly across the hills as the clouds moved like something searching. Eli made a sound beside her. "Wow," he said. Just that, one word, the only word that was adequate. Delia stood very still and felt the pulling thing again, the thing from the bus that was older than hope or comfort. She stood there and let it happen to her, and she thought she stood here. Agnes stood on this exact ground and looked at this exact view every morning of her life, and she chose it, and she kept it, and no one had ever fully understood why. But standing here, Delia understood. She understood completely. She shifted Eli to her hip and walked toward the house. The key Marsh had given her was iron old and heavy, and it went into the lock with a stiff resistance that took both hands to overcome. The door swung inward, slowly releasing air that had been held inside for more than a year, cool and still and layered with the smell of dust and cedar and old wood and something else beneath all of it, something faint and human, the residue of a life lived in small rooms over many years. She stepped over the threshold. The inside of the house had the quality of a paused moment, furniture covered in sheets like sleeping figures, dust on every surface thick enough to write in. The last calendar Agnes had used still hung on the kitchen wall, turned to a month 14 months previous. A mug sat on the counter beside the stove handle, facing outward, as if placed there this morning, and not 14 months ago, by someone who had then walked out the door and not returned. Delia moved through the rooms, slowly holding Eli's hand when he walked beside her and carrying him when the footing was uncertain. She noted the stone fireplace adequate, the kitchen with its porcelain sink and its old stove both functional by her assessment, the stairs sound, the two bedrooms upstairs small but real. She stood longest in the back bedroom, Agnes's room. The quilt on the bed was handmade, its colors still true, despite the dust on everything else, deep reds and blues, and an earthy gold pieced together with stitching so small and regular it looked like something a machine had done. Her mother had told her that, one of the very few things. She said her mother could quilt like no one she had ever seen. Delia touched the edge of the quilt with two fingers. A small desk sat under the window that looked out over the valley. On it, a few books, their spines worn soft with handling. A field guide to Appalachian birds, a collection of poetry, and then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Gerald Marsh," she answered. His voice was different than it had been in the office, clipped, slightly elevated in the way of a man delivering news he cannot quite contextualize. "Ms. Holt," he said, "I'm glad I reached you. I've just spoken with the legal team at Pinnacle Land Group." She waited. "They've submitted a revised offer." A pause, just a beat too long. $250,000, effective until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The number moved through her like cold water. $250,000. Sitting in this dusty room, looking out at the valley with the handmade quilt within arm's reach, the number was so large it lost its meaning, became something abstract, became a shape without substance. And then the substance arrived. Because Delia had not told anyone where she was going. She had not told Marsh. She had not told Jimmy. She had not told Mrs. Paulson anything more than that she needed a few days. She had bought the bus tickets in cash. She had told no one. And yet Pinnacle Land Group had called Gerald Marsh approximately 40 minutes after she arrived at this property with a new offer that was more than 3 times the first one. Someone knew she was here. Someone had watched her arrive. She stood very still by the window that looked out over the valley. The light on the mountains had not changed. The river still curved through the valley floor far below. Eli was sitting on the edge of the bed and examining the quilt with small, careful hands. "Ms. Holt," Marsh said on the phone. "Are you there?" "I'm here," she said. Her voice was steady. She had Agnes Holt's eyes, and now she thought she might also have something of Agnes Holt's stillness, the stillness of someone who has been told the shape of the fight and is quietly calculating how to stand in it. "I'll need to think about it," she said. Marsh told her she did not have much time to think. He told her one more time that this was the smart move. He told her the house was in bad shape. He told her the offer was extraordinary. She thanked him and ended the call. She put the phone in her pocket and stood at the window and looked out at the valley for a long time after that, not thinking about the number, not thinking about the 30 days or the back taxes or the sagging porch roof or the Civic's transmission. Thinking instead about what Dale had said on the drive in, protecting something. Not hiding, protecting. Those are different things. She looked around the bedroom one more time. The quilt, the desk, the bird guide, and then she noticed something she had not noticed when she first came in. Under the bed, in the deep shadow against the wall, just visible as a darker shape against the dusty floor. The edge of something, something large. She knelt and reached, and her fingers found leather. Old, worn, solid leather. She pulled it toward her, and it came heavily, reluctantly, with the resistance of something that had not been moved in a long time. She pulled it into the light that fell through the window, and she saw it clearly. A trunk. A large old steamer trunk bound in leather straps with brass fittings green with age. On the top, almost invisible under the accumulated dust of many years, 2 letters were stamped into the leather. A.H. Agnes Holt. Delia sat back on her heels and looked at it, and the room was very quiet around her, and outside the window the valley lay open and ancient and full of light, and her son said softly from the bed behind her, "What is it, Mama?" She pressed her hand flat against the top of the trunk. The leather was cool and slightly rough under her palm. "I don't know yet," she said, but she thought she was beginning to. The Holt ground, Part 2, what the old woman built. The lock was brass and it was old and it was not going to open without a fight. Delia tried the iron key from Marsh's envelope first on the theory that Agnes might have been practical enough to use one key for everything. The key did not fit. She tried it twice because she was not a person who gave up on a thing after one attempt, and then she accepted that it did not fit and set it aside. She looked at the trunk. The trunk looked back at her. Eli had climbed down from the bed and was standing beside her, one hand resting on the leather strap, the way he rested his hand on things he wanted to understand by touch. He had that quality from her, the need to make contact with things before deciding about them. "Stay here," she told him. She went downstairs to the fireplace. The iron poker was standing in the set of fireplace tools beside the hearth, exactly where it would have been in any house built in this style in this part of Pennsylvania in the middle of the last century. She picked it up. It was heavier than she expected and cold in her hand, and it felt in the way that certain objects feel in certain moments entirely purposeful. She went back upstairs. She wedged the tapered end of the poker into the gap between the lock's hasp and the trunk's face, and she leaned into it with her full weight. The lock groaned. Old metal resisting the way old things resist, not from strength exactly, but from the accumulated inertia of years spent in one position. She reset her grip. She pushed again harder this time. Her jaw set, her feet braced against the floorboards. The lock broke with a sound like a small bone. The hasp fell. The clasps released. Delia set the poker aside and knelt in front of the trunk and put both hands on the lid. She hesitated. It was a strange moment, that hesitation. She was not, as a rule, a hesitant person. Hesitation was a luxury, like sitting down in the morning, like the space required for fear. But she held still for just a moment with her hands on the lid of Agnes Holt's trunk and understood that whatever was inside it was going to change something, and that once you knew a thing, you could not unknow it, and that there was a last moment before knowing that you could, if you chose, remain in. She lifted the lid. The smell came first, cedar clean and sharp and dry, and beneath it the smell of old paper, the particular dry dust scent of documents kept in careful order over many years. Not the smell of decay, not the smell of abandonment, the smell of something preserved. She looked inside. It was not what she had expected. She had expected in some unexamined way the contents of a life, photographs, letters, the accumulated sentimental debris of decades, the things people keep in trunks at the ends of their lives, the soft evidence of who they were. What she found instead was the hard evidence of what Agnes Holt had done. Paper. Stacks and stacks of it, organized with a precision that felt almost aggressive in its neatness. Each bundle tied with cotton twine, each bundle labeled in the same small, deliberate handwriting. Bank statements going back to the early 1980s arranged by year. Receipts for lumber, for roofing, tin for concrete, mix for a well pump for replacement, windows for a furnace, for 3 separate roof repairs across 3 separate decades. Receipts for hardware, for tools, for the particular specialized materials required to maintain a structure over the long resistance of time. Receipts for the property taxes themselves paid year after year in cash, the handwritten amounts increasing slowly over the decades as assessments rose. Every receipt marked paid in full. Delia sat back on her heels and understood what she was looking at. This was not the record of neglect. This was the opposite of neglect. This was the record of a woman who had built something with her hands and then spent the next 30 years refusing to let it fall quietly and without witness, and apparently without any expectation of credit paying for it all in cash, so that no lender could hold it, maintaining it with her own labor, so that no contractor could claim a lien, keeping every receipt in dated order in a cedar-lined trunk, so that if anyone ever came to challenge her ownership, there would be nothing, not one piece of paper anywhere that they could use against her. Delia thought about the stories Dale had mentioned on the drive-in, that she was odd, that she was neglectful, that the house was falling down. The house was standing. Delia had walked through every room of it. The floors were sound. The roof had been repaired. She could see the dates on the receipts, the most recent just 4 years ago. The well pump had been replaced 6 years before that, the furnace before that. Agnes Holt had not been neglecting this house. Agnes Holt had been maintaining this house while simultaneously making everyone believe she was neglecting it. Those were different things. Delia reached into the trunk again. Near the top of the pile, lying flat across the bundled documents, as though placed there deliberately, as though placed there last, was an envelope, long and white, her name written on it in the same small, deliberate hand. Delia, just that, no last name, no return address, just her first name written by someone who had apparently been confident she would be the one to open this trunk, who had apparently planned for this moment with enough certainty to prepare for it, and then had waited and kept waiting and eventually run out of time to wait any longer. Delia's hands were not steady when she picked it up. She sat down on the floor with her back against the side of the bed, Eli settling naturally into the space beside her, the way small children settle into the spaces adults leave for them, warm and solid and entirely trusting. She broke the seal. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent in the gray afternoon light from the window. Several pages covered front and back in that careful handwriting, the pen pressed firmly enough that she could feel the impressions of the letters on the reverse side. She read, Agnes Holt wrote the way she had apparently done everything, without decoration, without preamble, without any of the softening language people use when they are afraid of what they are saying. She wrote as someone who had been waiting a long time to say a thing and had decided finally to say it plainly. She wrote about Roy Holt. Delia had not known her grandfather's name until she read it in that letter, sitting on the floor of the back bedroom, with the October light coming through the window and the valley spread out behind the glass. Roy Holt. She turned the name over in her mind as she read this stranger who was half the origin of her mother and therefore a quarter of the origin of her. He had been handsome, Agnes wrote. She wrote it without bitterness, as a fact. The way you note a weather pattern. It happened, it was real, it had consequences. He was charming in the way of men who have learned that charm is a tool, and he was funny, and he loved this land when he first came to it, because he saw in it the same thing everyone saw when they stood on that slope and looked out over the valley. But what Roy Holt loved about beautiful things was what they could be exchanged for. He owed money. He had owed money for most of their marriage, to men of the kind who did not send polite letters when the payment schedule slipped. He had mortgaged the property once without telling her, and she had found out when a man came to the door. She had paid it. He had mortgaged it again to different men, and she had paid that too. When she understood that there was no version of this story in which Roy stopped because men like Roy did not stop, they simply found new creditors and new justifications. She made a decision. She divorced him. She had their daughter, who was 7 years old at the time, and she sent her to Agnes's sister in Harrisburg, telling the child it was temporary, telling her she would come for her soon. It was not a lie exactly. Agnes had intended to come for her soon. But soon was contingent on Roy releasing his claim to the property and Roy's creditors releasing their claim to Roy. And neither of those things happened quickly. And the men Roy owed were not patient men. And the only way Agnes had found to make herself and the property unattractive to them was to make herself appear to have nothing worth taking. She stopped maintaining the outward appearance of the house. She let the paint go. She let the porches echo. She let people see what they expected to see when they looked at a woman alone on 5 acres of rural Pennsylvania, a woman declining a property, declining nothing here worth the trouble. The back taxes were a calculated strategy. She paid them, always the receipts in the trunk were proof of that, but she paid them late year after year so that the county records would show a delinquent account, so that any developer doing due diligence would see a property with complications, would calculate the friction of dealing with a difficult owner in a messy tax situation, and would, she hoped, look elsewhere? And she stopped writing to her daughter. This was the part of the letter where the handwriting changed just slightly, still controlled, still deliberate. But the pen had pressed harder, leaving deeper impressions in the thin paper. She had written letters for the first 3 years. She had sent them to her sister's address in Harrisburg, addressed to her daughter, careful letters that said little of substance because she did not trust that they were not being read by others first. Her daughter had not written back, and Agnes had not known whether that was because the letters were being intercepted or because her daughter had been told something that made her not want to write back, or simply because a 10-year-old girl who had been sent away by her mother and not retrieved had decided with the absolute finality of children that her mother was lost to her. Agnes had eventually stopped writing because maintaining contact meant being findable, and being findable meant Roy's creditors could find her. And the men Roy owed were capable of using a child as leverage. She had seen them do it to others. She was not willing to provide them with one, so she chose the harder protection. She closed the door. She became unreachable. She let her daughter believe what a daughter in those circumstances would naturally believe, that she had been left, that she had been chosen against, that the land and the trees were more important than she was. None of that was true. All of it was necessary. When her daughter died, and Agnes had found out 12 years ago now, through her sister, through the distant relay of family information that persists even when relationships have been severed, Agnes had written to her sister to find out about the child. About Delia. She had learned that Delia was in the foster system, which meant Delia was officially visible, officially documented, officially traceable. Any contact Agnes made would create a record. Roy was gone by then, but some of the men he had owed were not, and old debts in certain circles were not subject to statute of limitations. She had waited. She had waited until she could not wait any longer, until the body she had used to build and maintain this house for 30 years finally refused to continue, until the doctors used words that made waiting a finite proposition. And then she had written this letter and placed it in the trunk and added the deed to the envelope Marsh would send, and she had left Delia $2 bills, the same $2 bills she had carried in her coat pocket since the day Roy's creditors had come to the door for the last time, the day she had looked at them and understood what this was going to cost. She had kept them for 30 years. She had left them to Delia because she wanted Delia to laugh. She wrote that directly without apology. She said, "I know what you will do when you see those $2 in that office. I know because I would do the same thing, and we are the same, you and I, even though we have never met. I wanted you to laugh even in that moment, especially in that moment." And then she wrote, "Come home. Come and see what I built for you. Come and see that you were never left with nothing." Delia had stopped being able to see the words clearly somewhere in the middle of the second page. She did not realize it until she found herself reading the same line 3 times without comprehension, and she pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes and held it there. And the grief that moved through her was enormous and complex and layered in the way that only very old griefs are: grief for her grandmother, whom she had never known, grief for her mother who had died believing herself abandoned, Grief for all the years of that misunderstanding. Grief for the little girl sent to Harrisburg who had waited for a mother who was fighting a war the little girl could not be told about. Eli put his hand on her arm. He did not say anything. He was 3 years old and he did not have the words for what he was witnessing, but he had the instinct and he put a small warm hand on her arm and left it there, and she reached up and covered it with her own. She sat there for a while, long enough for the light to shift, long enough for the shadows in the room to lengthen and change their angles. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it aside, and she looked back into the trunk. There was more. Beneath the organized bundles of receipts and statements, beneath everything she had already examined, the bottom of the trunk did not sit flush with the sides. She had not noticed it before because she had not been looking for it, but now she saw it, a slight gap along one edge, a fraction of an inch, barely visible, and worked into one corner of the cedar planking, almost invisible against the natural grain of the wood, a small loop of dark fabric. Delia pulled it. The false bottom lifted. She looked at what was underneath it for a long moment without moving. Then she looked at the window, at the valley, at the mountains beyond the valley, at the sky beyond the mountains. She looked at Eli. She looked back down. The money was bundled in the way that people bundle money when they are saving it slowly over a long period of time, not in the neat uniform packets of a bank, but in irregular groups held by rubber bands gone brittle with age, mixed denominations, 10s and 20s and 50s, and here and there 100, all of it soft and worn in the way of currency that has been handled. Not the fortune it might have looked like at first glance, not a number that rearranged the world, but more considerably more than $2, more than a year's worth of her salary at Carver's, possibly 2 years. Beside the money, a small velvet pouch, deep green, drawn shut with a cord. Inside it, the key to the trunk's lock, which was no longer needed, in a folded piece of paper. She opened the paper. It was brief. Agnes had said what needed saying in the letter. This was not a letter. This was a note. It read, "This is your foundation, not an escape. The land is what I leave you. This is what lets you build on it. Come home and build something. The choice is yours, it always will be. But you are not starting from nothing. You never were. You are starting from love." Delia read it twice, then she folded it and held it for a moment with both hands. Outside, the afternoon was getting on. The light through the window had gone from clear to golden, the specific gold of late afternoon in October when the sun drops toward the ridge line and the light comes in at an angle and turns everything it touches into something slightly more than itself. And then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She almost let it go. She had the instinct in that moment to let the world outside this room wait a little longer to stay in the suspended time of the trunk and the letter and the money and the note. But she answered. The voice on the other end was not Marsh. It was a man's voice, careful and measured in the way of someone accustomed to being listened to. He introduced himself as Victor Crane. He said he was the regional director of Pinnacle Land Group. He said he hoped he was not disturbing her. She said nothing. He said he understood she was visiting the property and that he would love the opportunity to speak with her in person. He said that he had always had a great deal of respect for her grandmother's attachment to the land. He said it in the way that people say things they want to sound like respect but are actually the opposite, a quality of patience, in the voice that was not kindness, but something that had learned to wear kindness as a surface. She told him that her number was unlisted and asked how he had obtained it. A brief pause. Then he said that Pinnacle had extensive resources and that he hoped she would take that not as a threat but as an indication of how serious they were about reaching a mutually beneficial agreement. She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, her unlisted number, her location, which she had told no one, the timing of the offer arriving 40 minutes after she did. She had thought earlier that someone knew she was here. She had filed it away as a question because she had the quality when under pressure of filing questions away rather than reacting to them, of dealing with one thing at a time. Now the question had an answer, or the shape of one. They had been watching this property. She did not know for how long. Long enough to know when a car arrived on the dirt track or a woman and a small child walked up the path from where a taxi had left them. Long enough to make a call within the hour. Long enough to get her number from somewhere in their extensive resources. 30 years, Dale had said. They had been trying to buy this property for 30 years. She thought about what that meant. Not the inconvenience of it, not the money of it, The commitment of it, the investment of time and attention and effort directed at one small piece of land in the hills of rural Pennsylvania, sustained for 3 decades through personnel changes and market cycles, and the repeated consistent refusals of one woman who lived alone on a sagging porch and appeared to have nothing. Companies like Pinnacle did not sustain that kind of attention towards something with no value. They sustained it towards something with enormous value that they had not yet been able to acquire. Agnes had known that. Agnes had known the whole time exactly what she was sitting on. Delia got up from the floor and went to the window and looked out at the valley. The river caught the last of the afternoon light, throwing it back in pieces, and the mountains beyond were going to blue and purple at their crests, and the sky above them was doing something magnificent with color that she did not have names for: amber and rose, and a deep particular green that appeared at the horizon just before dark in the fall. She heard tires on the dirt track. She turned from the window. She came downstairs carefully, Eli behind her on the stairs, both of them quiet. Through the front window she could see the track that led to the house, and on it, pulling slowly forward through the encroaching brush, a black SUV. Not Dale's old sedan. Something new. Something that announced itself by being out of place here. It stopped in front of the house. A man got out. He was in his 50s. He wore a gray suit that was entirely wrong for the mud of this road and the temperature of this October afternoon, and he wore it with the confidence of someone who expected the world to accommodate itself to his attire rather than the reverse. His hair was silver at the temples. He had the build of someone who had been athletic once and had preserved enough of it to still be imposing. He looked at the house. He looked at the porch. He looked at the front door as though taking an inventory. Then he knocked. Delia opened the door. Victor Crane smiled. It was a constructed smile. She could see the construction of it, the careful positioning of warmth over something that was not warm. He said her name. He said it was good to finally meet her. He said he hoped the drive had not been too difficult. He looked past her into the house. She did not step aside. She did not invite him in. He told her he understood she had had a difficult week, losing a family member she had not been close to, dealing with an unexpected estate. He said he wanted her to know that Pinnacle had always had the deepest respect for Agnes Holt's attachment to this land. He said they had simply wanted to be responsible stewards of a property that deserved better than what it had received. She said, "My grandmother built this house herself and maintained it for 30 years. It has received exactly what it deserved." Something moved across his face, brief and quickly contained, but she saw it, a recalibration, the adjustment of an approach that had met unexpected resistance. He said he hoped she would not make a decision based on sentiment. He said $250,000 was a genuinely extraordinary offer for a property in this condition. He said the offer had a deadline and that he would hate for her to miss it on the basis of an attachment to a place she had never seen before today. He looked past her again, this time toward the stairs, from behind which Eli had appeared, standing 2 steps up from the bottom watching. Crane looked at Eli. He looked back at Delia with the specific kind of smile that is not a smile at all, but a reference to one, the implication of one placed there deliberately, so that the other person understands it has been placed there deliberately. He said, "It must be a lot managing all of this, with a little one." The air in the doorway changed. Delia felt it change the way you feel, weather change, a drop in pressure, a new quality to the light. She felt it and she recognized it for what it was, and she stood in the doorway of her grandmother's house with both hands loose at her sides, and her voice came out level and clear. "Mr. Crane," she said, "you're standing on private property. I'm going to ask you to return to your vehicle." He looked at her for a moment. The constructed smile held. He was, she thought, a man who had been told no a certain number of times in his professional life and had learned to categorize refusals, the ones that were opening positions and the ones that were final. He was categorizing her now. She held his gaze. He said it had been a pleasure. He said he hoped she would think carefully. He said the offer expired at 9 the next morning and that he would be reachable. He went back to the SUV. She watched it reverse down the track until it was gone. Then she stood for a moment in the open doorway with the cold air coming in from the valley and Eli's small hand finding hers from behind, and she thought about Agnes Holt standing in the same doorway at some point in the past 3 decades, watching some other car reverse down that same track. Some other man in a suit. 30 years. She closed the door. She went back upstairs and sat down on the floor beside the open trunk and picked up the letter again, and she read the last two pages that she had not been able to read clearly before reading them now with dry eyes, and the particular clarity that comes after grief has moved through you and left the air cleaner. Agnes wrote at the end, "I know what the money will look like to you. I know what that number looks like when you are standing in the place you are standing. I have stood in the same place at different times, and I know the pull of it, how much easier it would be to let them have it, to take what they are offering, and walk back into your life with something in your hands. I am not asking you to refuse them because of me. I am not asking you to refuse them at all. You may do exactly as you see fit with this land. It is yours. I give it to you freely and without condition. But I want you to know what it is before you decide. It is not a burden. It is not a problem. It is not a liability that needs to be managed. It is 5 acres of the most beautiful ground I have ever stood on, and it looks out over a valley that changes every hour of the day. And in the spring, there is a creek at the bottom of the slope that sounds like something being healed. And in the fall, the trees do things with color that no one who has not seen it will believe when you describe it. It is a place to stand. You have spent your whole life with no place to stand, no ground that was yours, no piece of the world that could not be taken from you, with a rent increase or a landlord's notice or the decisions of people who do not know your name. I know this because I know what I left your mother with, and I know what she left you with, and I am asking you to forgive me for both of those things while also telling you that I spent 30 years trying to fix them. Come home. Build something. You are a Holt. We do not run from the ground. We come from it." Delia held the last page for a long time after she finished reading. Outside the window, the valley had gone to dusk, the mountains purple now, against the sky still faintly green above the western ridge. The first stars were appearing in the east. The creek at the bottom of the slope, Ember Creek, she would learn its name later, was not audible from here, but she knew it was there. She thought about Carver's diner and the ridge in her back, and the 455 alarm, and the leaking faucet, and Mrs. Paulson's fee paid in cash every Friday, and the Civic's transmission, and the rent notice on the kitchen table back in Philadelphia. She thought about $250,000. She thought about Agnes Holt standing in this room every morning and looking out at that valley with no one watching and no one knowing and no one giving her any credit at all for what she was doing and doing it anyway. She thought about $2 bills in a coat pocket carried for 30 years left to a granddaughter, so she would laugh in a lawyer's office and then maybe come and find out why. She looked at Eli. He had fallen asleep against the side of the bed with his stuffed dog, his breathing slow and even his face perfectly composed in the way of children who have not yet learned to wear the expressions of their worries. She reached out and touched his hair. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. She had until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to decide what kind of person she was going to be. She picked up the letter and folded it carefully along its creases and placed it back in the envelope. She placed the envelope back in the trunk. She placed the note from the false bottom in with it. Then she got up and carried Eli to the bed with the handmade quilt, and she pulled the quilt over him, and she sat on the edge of the bed beside her sleeping son and looked out the window at the darkening valley and the rising stars. And she thought about ground and what it meant to have some and what it cost to keep it. The Holt Ground, Part 3. The Holt Ground holds. She woke before the alarm she had not set. The room was dark in the particular way of rural dark, which is not the dark of cities, not the dark interrupted by streetlights and headlights and the ambient orange glow of 10,000 lit windows. This was the complete dark, the original dark, the kind of dark that existed before people decided to push it back. She lay still in it for a moment on the narrow strip of bed beside Eli, and she listened. Wind in the trees above the house. The distant sound of the creek, which she could just barely hear when the wind paused between gusts. An owl somewhere in the forest to the north making its low repetitive inquiry into the darkness. She lay still and she breathed and she let the dark be dark and the quiet be quiet, and she did not think about 9 o'clock. Then she got up. She found the kitchen by memory and by the faint gray suggestion of the window above the sink, and she ran water from the tap and stood at the counter and drank a glass of it. The water tasted of iron and minerals of the deep rock it had come from, of the ground itself. She had spent her entire life drinking municipal water that tasted of treatment and pipe, and this was different in a way she could not fully articulate, more present somehow, more actual. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark slope behind the house where the meadow was, though she could not see it. She could feel it, the openness of the land as it fell away toward the creek. The difference in the air above open ground versus the air beneath trees. She had not known until yesterday that she could feel that. She supposed it was something you learned when the ground was yours. 9 o'clock. She looked at the clock on her phone. It was 5:47 in the morning. She went outside. The porch held her weight without complaint, though the left side still sagged, and she stepped over the soft board, there automatically having noted its location yesterday. The air was cold and very clear. The specific cold of October at elevation, and above her the sky was doing the thing that skies do in the last hour before dawn, in places with no light pollution, blazing with stars in a density she had never seen. The whole arch of it thick with light, the Milky Way visible as an actual band of diffuse brightness running from one horizon to the other. She stood on the porch and looked up at it for a long time. She thought about Agnes standing on this same porch on mornings she would never know, looking up at this same sky mile. 30 years of mornings. 30 years of this alone without anyone to say, look at that, without anyone to turn to. Just the sky and the valley and the work of another day ahead. The strength required for that was a thing Delia could only begin to estimate. She went back inside when the cold got serious about itself, and she started a fire in the kitchen stove with wood from the small stack beside the back door dry and split, and ready as though Agnes had expected a guest, as though she had left it just in case. The fire caught on the third try, and the warmth that began to move through the kitchen was the warmest thing Delia had felt in longer than she could account for. Eli came downstairs at 7, trailing his stuffed dog, his hair pressed flat on one side and vertical on the other. He looked at the lit stove with serious appreciation and then looked at her and said, "Can we stay?" She looked at him for a moment, 3 years old and already asking the right questions. "We're going to find out," she said. She fed him crackers and peanut butter from what she had packed, and she drank the last of the coffee from the thermos she had brought from Philadelphia. And she sat at the kitchen table in Agnes's house while the fire worked and the light came up outside and the valley emerged from the dark in stages. First the slope below the house, then the meadow, then the trees along the creek, then the river in the valley floor, catching the first horizontal light and throwing it back silver. At 8:15, she called Gerald Marsh. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been waiting. She told him she was not selling. The silence on his end lasted several seconds. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a man recalibrating, not unkind, not condescending, but genuinely working through the information. He went through the numbers one more time, not as argument, she thought, but as professional obligation, the way a doctor tells you the risks even when you have already made your decision. He mentioned the back taxes. He mentioned the condition of the house. He mentioned the deadline. She said, "I understand all of that. I'm not selling." Another pause. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" It was a different question than any he had asked before. She noted it. She told him she needed the exact figure on the back taxes and the account information for the county assessor's office. She told him she would handle it directly. He gave her the information without further comment and told her to call him if she needed anything else. And then he said something she had not expected from a man who had spent their entire acquaintance advising her to take the money and leave. He said, "Your grandmother would be pleased." She ended the call and sat with the phone on the table in front of her for a moment. Then she picked it up again and called Dale. He answered with the brevity of a man who did not consider greetings essential. She told him she needed a ride into Millhaven. She told him she also needed the name of a good roofer. There was a pause, and in it she could hear something not quite surprise, but the adjustment of an expectation. Then he said, "You're staying." "I'm staying," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, and then she heard underneath the breath something that might have been a small sound of satisfaction, the kind of sound a man makes when something turns out the way he quietly hoped it would. "Roofer's name is Jeb Carlson," Dale said. "His father did work for your grandmother 20 years back. Good man, fair price. I'll have his number for you when I pick you up." The drive into Millhaven took 20 minutes on the county road with the October hills rolling past on both sides and the morning light doing its best work on the turning leaves. Eli sat in the back and watched it all with the focused attention he gave everything new. Dale drove and talked in the spare useful way he had, pointing out the grain elevator that marked the edge of town, the hardware store, that was the only one within 40 miles of the library that was also the post office on Tuesdays. He pointed out the county offices when they passed them. Tax assessor's in there, he said. Second door on the left. She had the cash in an envelope in her bag. She had counted it twice the night before by the light of her phone, careful, deliberate, the way Agnes had apparently done everything. There was enough. There was more than enough for the taxes and more beyond that for what came next for Jeb Carlson's roof estimate and a used truck she would need before winter in the months ahead while she figured out the shape of the life she was building. Not a fortune, a foundation. The woman at the tax assessor's window had short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in the efficient manner of someone who had processed every variety of human circumstance across a county clerk's counter and been surprised by very little of it. She took the envelope and counted the bills with practiced speed and stamped 3 separate documents with 3 separate stamps, each stamp landing with a finality that Delia felt in her chest. She slid the receipts across the counter. Taxes are paid in full on the Holt property through end of year, she said. Then she looked up over her glasses and looked at Delia directly for the first time. She looked for a moment at Eli standing at the counter's edge with his chin just clearing it. She looked back at Delia. You Agnes's granddaughter, she said. Yes, Delia said. The woman nodded slowly as though confirming something she had already suspected. She came in here herself every year, always in October, always cash. She paused. She never said much, but she always said thank you when I gave her the receipt, every single year. She pushed the receipts a little further across the counter. Welcome to Harlan County, Ms. Holt. Jeb Carlson came out the following morning with his 2 sons, both of them versions of their father, at different scales, broad through the shoulders, careful with their hands, speaking only when the work required it. He walked the roof for 20 minutes while Delia stood in the yard with Eli and waited. When he came down the ladder, he stood in front of her and told her what it needed without any preamble or softening, which she appreciated. He quoted her a price. She said yes. He looked at her for a moment and she could see him thinking, assembling something he wanted to say carefully. My dad did work for your grandmother, he said. 1990-something, fixed the furnace flue and repointed the chimney. He said she paid him right on the spot and shook his hand like a man. He paused. He talked about her now and then, said she was the kind of person that made you feel like what you did mattered. He nodded once the way men nod when they have said the thing and do not intend to add to it. We'll start Thursday, he said. The community she found did not announce itself. It simply appeared gradually in the way that things that have been waiting a long time begin to move when they see their moment. Ruth at the general store started putting aside the previous day's bread for her just placed in a paper bag behind the counter, without being asked, without any ceremony attached to it. Dale refused to charge her for half his drives and became skilled at looking unaware when she tried to bring it up. The woman at the hardware store remembered what she had bought the previous visit and had it waiting. It was not charity. It was something older than charity, the specific generosity of a small community that had watched one of its members hold a lonely post for 30 years and now saw the post being held by someone who had come from that person and understood without discussion what that meant and what it asked of them. Delia had grown up in the city where neighbors were strangers, and strangers were the ambient condition of existence. This was different. This was a place that had noticed her grandmother's absence and was now noticing her presence quietly and without fanfare in the way of people who do not put feelings into speeches, but into actions, into paper bags of bread and refused fares and items waiting behind counters. She had not known until now that this kind of thing still existed. She had not known how much she had been missing it. The weeks settled into shape. Jeb and his sons repaired the roof in 3 days, working with the concentrated efficiency of people who respected weather forecasts and knew October in Pennsylvania made no promises. The sound of their work hammers and boots on new sheathing was the most optimistic sound she had heard in years. The well pump she serviced herself with a kit from the hardware store and a tutorial from a man named Warren at the library, who seemed to have personally supervised the maintenance of every mechanical system in the county over the past 4 decades. She opened the windows as the work progressed and the air moved through the house, and the dust that had accumulated over the year of Agnes's absence lifted and dispersed, and the rooms became rooms again instead of preserved spaces. She washed Agnes's quilt by hand in the kitchen sink and dried it on the line she restrung between the back porch posts, and it hung there in the October wind, its colors true and brilliant, visible from the slope below, visible from a long way off. She enrolled Eli in the small preschool in Millhaven, a 2-morning-a-week arrangement that the director had managed to make affordable. On the mornings he was there, Delia worked on the house moving room by room with a systematic attention she had learned from Agnes's receipts. Document first, understand the problem, then address it in the correct order. She was not a carpenter, and she was not an electrician, and she was not a plumber, but she was organized and she could follow instructions, and she could ask for help from the right people, and it turned out that this was most of what was required. On the mornings Eli was home, he worked beside her. He was 3, but he was earnest about it, carrying small items from one place to another with tremendous seriousness, handing her things she asked for and some she did not, maintaining a running commentary on the proceedings. She watched him on those mornings, this small person navigating the rooms of the house with increasing confidence, learning the locations of things, learning the particular squeak of the third stair, and the way the kitchen door needed to be lifted slightly before it would close, flush. And she thought about Agnes, who had no one to do this with, who had done all of it in the silence of her own company. She thought about her mother, who had grown up in Harrisburg believing she was unwanted, who had come to adulthood carrying that weight, who had passed some version of it down without meaning to. The story of being left, the story of not being chosen. She thought about how much damage a lie told in the service of love could do moving forward through time, accumulating interest. She thought about Eli, who would not carry that story, who was 3 years old and living in a house that had been built and held for him by a woman he would never meet on 5 acres of ground that looked out over a valley that changed every hour in a county that was learning his name. He would not carry the story. She would make sure of it. It was a Wednesday in November, 3 weeks after she had paid the back taxes, when Marsh called again. She was on the porch in the late afternoon, the repaired boards solid under her feet, watching Eli in the meadow below the house where he had found something in the tall grass that required his complete attention. The mountains to the west were doing something with the clouds that she had come to understand was specific to this latitude and this season, building them into towers above the ridgeline, backlit by a sun already dropping, so that the light came through the gaps in the clouds in long, defined shafts that swept slowly across the valley floor like something searching. She had stopped being able to look at it without feeling something shift in her chest. Marsh's voice was different again, a third version of him, distinct from the professional neutrality of the first meeting and the quiet recalibration of the morning she had refused the offer. This version was more direct, more considered. The voice of a man who had been thinking about something and had decided to say it plainly. "I've had a call from Pinnacle," he said. She waited. "Not Crane," he said. "Their general counsel. They want to discuss a conservation easement on the back portion of the property, the section that borders the state forest." She knew the term. She had spent time in the Millhaven Library's public computers in the weeks after arriving, researching everything she could find about property rights and conservation law in Pennsylvania. A conservation easement meant she would sell the development rights to a portion of the land, specifically the right to build on it while retaining full ownership. The land would remain hers. It would simply be permanently protected from development. She said, "Why now? Why do they want to protect land they've been trying to develop for 30 years? Marsh paused, and in the pause she understood that he had been waiting for her to ask this, that this was the part of the call he had been moving toward. "Because they can't develop without it," he said. He explained it carefully and completely, in the methodical way of a man presenting information he finds genuinely remarkable. Pinnacle's development project, the luxury cabin resort that had been their justification for 30 years of acquisition attempts, required approval from the Pennsylvania Environmental Quality Board. That approval was contingent on demonstrating that the wildlife corridor connecting the state forest to the river valley would be preserved. Without that corridor, the project failed its environmental review. Without the environmental review, the project did not get built. The wildlife corridor ran directly through the back portion of the Holt property. Pinnacle had known this for years. Agnes had known this for years. What Pinnacle had not known, what their lawyers and surveyors and developers had apparently failed to discover in 30 years of due diligence, was that Agnes had filed a conservation covenant on that same corridor 15 years ago. filed it under the name of a small, local land trust she had quietly organized, not under her own name, which was why it had not appeared in their title searches. The land trust that held the covenant could not be dissolved without the signature of its sole remaining trustee. Agnes Holt had been its sole remaining trustee, though the trusteeship had passed to her heir. Marsh let that sit for a moment. "Ms. Holt," he said, and she could hear something in his voice she had not heard before, a quality of controlled awe, the tone of a man who has been a lawyer for 30 years and thought he had seen every variation of human strategy and had just encountered a variation he had not previously imagined. "Your grandmother structured this 15 years ago with the specific intention that the development rights could only be released by you. Not sold, not transferred. Released by the trustee through an easement agreement. She needed Pinnacle to need me," Delia said. "Yes," Marsh said. "Because if they needed me, they couldn't threaten me." "That is my reading of it," he said. She stood on the repaired porch of Agnes Holt's house and looked out at the valley, and she thought about a woman sitting alone at a desk 15 years ago reading conservation law, filing paperwork under a name no one would trace to her, setting a trap so patient and so precisely designed that it would not be triggered until after she was gone. Agnes had not just been protecting the land. She had been building the circumstance under which her granddaughter would have power. Not money, not a clean break. Power. The specific power of being the person that the other party cannot proceed without. Delia's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with grief. It was something else. Something she did not have a ready word for. The particular emotion of understanding fully and finally that someone you never knew had loved you in a way that required 30 years of patience and loneliness and strategic thinking to express. She exhaled slowly. "Tell their general counsel I'm willing to have a conversation," she said. "Tell them I prefer to speak directly. No intermediaries." Marsh said he would relay the message. Victor Crane called the next morning. He did not come to the house this time. He called. She supposed the last visit had communicated something that made him reassess the approach. His voice was different than it had been on the porch 2 weeks ago. The constructed warmth was gone. What remained was the actual man underneath it, still careful, still controlled, but speaking now from the place where professional courtesy ends and direct negotiation begins. She respected it more than the performance. He said he understood she had elected to remain on the property. She said she had. He said he assumed she was aware of the covenant situation. She said she was. He said Pinnacle was prepared to offer her a substantial payment for the conservation easement on the rear acreage. He named a figure. It was large. It was, she suspected, the largest number Pinnacle's lawyers had determined they could justify to their board as a reasonable acquisition cost. She said, "Mr. Crane, I want you to understand something. My grandmother spent 30 years living alone on this land, making herself look poor and difficult and eccentric, specifically so that you could not take it from her. She filed a legal instrument 15 years ago under a name you couldn't trace specifically so that I would have this conversation from a position of strength rather than desperation. That is the level of commitment that exists on this side of the conversation." A silence. "I'm going to need more than a payment," she said. She told him what she needed. The easement payment non-negotiable on the minimum, and her minimum was higher than his opening figure. The payment to be structured as a land trust endowment, not a lump sum, so that it would generate income for the property in perpetuity and could not be spent down by one bad year or one more emergency. Pinnacle to fund the full restoration of the house and the barn using contractors of her selection, documented to historic preservation standards, because the house was not just her home, it was a record of something, and it was going to be treated as one. And the land trust, the one Agnes had organized and filed and maintained for 15 years against this exact moment, to be formally renamed and endowed. The Agnes Holt Conservation Trust. She said the name clearly, fully, without hesitation. Another silence. Longer this time. She waited in it without discomfort. She had learned something in the weeks since coming here about silence, that it was not empty, that it had texture and information, that you could learn things from it if you did not rush to fill it. Agnes had known this. Agnes had been fluent in silence. Delia was learning the language. Crane said, "The trust name is an unusual request." It's a condition, she said. She looked out the kitchen window at the meadow where Eli had played yesterday, still flattened in places where he had run through the grass, the path of a small person visible in the bent stems. Mr. Crane, she said, your company spent 30 years trying to take something from a woman who had nothing. She had nothing because she gave everything she had to making sure you couldn't. The least that Pinnacle Land Group can do is put her name on the things she built. The silence that followed was the longest yet. She heard him breathing. She heard behind the breath the specific quality of a man running calculations, not financial calculations, but the other kind, the ones that determine what a position is actually worth and what it costs to hold it, and whether the kind has become finally more than the position. I'll need to speak with our board, he said. Of course, she said, I'll be here. She ended the call and put the phone on the table and went to the window and stood there looking out at the November morning. The meadow grass was pale gold, now the color it went in the cold, and beyond it the bare trees along Ember Creek stood dark and clean against the sky, and beyond those the valley opened up and the mountains were gray-blue and still and present in the way they were every morning and every evening and every hour in between. She thought about her grandmother looking at this. She thought, I see it, Agnes. I see what you built. I see why. Marsh called 3 days later. The board had approved the terms. Their lawyers would draft the easement agreement and the trust documents. He asked her to review everything before signing. She said she would have her own lawyer look at it. A pause, then quietly, good. She signed on a Thursday in December in Marsh's office at the same desk where he had tipped $2 bills onto the polished wood 4 months before. Eli sat on her lap during the signing. He was not interested in the documents. He had found a paperclip and was exploring its properties with focused intensity. Marsh had the signed copies notarized and stamped and filed one set for her and one for his records. And then he poured 2 small glasses of water and set one in front of her and held the other and said without any preamble, your grandmother came into this office 8 years ago to discuss a revision to her will. I asked her why she was leaving the property to a grandchild she had never met, when there were conservation organizations that would have been grateful to receive it and would have ensured its protection. He paused. She said because conservation organizations don't need a place to stand. My granddaughter does. Delia looked at the water glass for a moment. Then she looked up. Did you believe her, she asked, that it would work out this way? Marsh considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I thought she was a woman who had thought about this longer and more carefully than I had. I thought the least I could do was execute her wishes correctly and see what happened. He lifted his glass slightly. Now I know. She drove back to Ember Ridge Road in the used truck he had bought in October, reliable 4-wheel drive, exactly what she needed and nothing more. Eli was asleep in his car seat before they cleared Millhaven the way he fell asleep in the car, suddenly and completely like a switch thrown. The road wound up through the hills, and the December light was low and very clean, coming in through the bare trees in long level shafts that made the forest look like a cathedral. She drove slowly because she was not in a hurry. She was not in a hurry for the first time in as long as she could remember. The arithmetic in her head, the constant calculating that had been the background noise of her entire adult life, hours against daycare, dollars against rent, this month against next month, had quieted to something manageable. Not gone. The work was not gone, the need for it was not gone. But it had changed in quality. It was now the arithmetic of building rather than the arithmetic of survival. And that was a different thing entirely. She pulled up the dirt track which she had graded in November and parked in front of the house. It looked different from when she had first seen it. The roof was new clean lines, dark shingles that would shed snow properly. The porch had been rebuilt, its boards sound and level, the left side no longer sagging. The window that had been boarded over was now replaced, its new glass catching the afternoon light. The paint was still peeling, but she had chosen her color for spring. The same blue, the original blue, the blue Agnes had chosen because she wanted the house to look like a home. She carried Eli inside without waking him and laid him on the bed upstairs under the quilt and tucked it around him. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her son, sleeping in her grandmother's room, under her grandmother's quilt, in the house her grandmother had built and held for 30 years, so that there would be a place one day for this exact moment. Then she went downstairs and put the kettle on the stove, and she got the photograph from where she had placed it on Agnes's desk, the young woman with wild hair and a streak of dirt on her cheek looking straight at the camera, with those dark, level, unafraid eyes, and she looked at it for a long time. She set it back on the desk facing the window that looked out over the valley. The kettle began to sound. Outside, the December sun was dropping toward the western ridge, and the light it threw across the valley was the horizontal gold of late afternoon in winter, and the mountains beyond the valley were doing their particular thing with color, and the river in the valley floor was silver and cold, and moving the way rivers move without hurry, without doubt along the ground that holds them. Delia poured her tea and stood at the window and looked at all of it. The ground held. It had always held. She was just the first one in a long time who had been able to stand on it and know it for what it was. Not an inheritance of money, not an asset on a balance sheet, not a number on a corporate offer sheet. A place to stand. Hers.